Okay, well, thanks everyone for being here and for inviting me for this talk. I was sitting listening to Rev's talk and I was thinking the chances of he and I speaking back to back in a conference anywhere in the world is actually pretty low because we travel in very different circles. But only in Armenia would you get someone who is at the very top of what he does in the AI field. And I've had the pleasure of working with him and Jensen Huang, and I know how highly NVIDIA thinks of Rev's contributions for decades, and also what you're going to hear from me. So just, last year when I participated, I said that I think we should be increasingly thinking of AI also as a form of Armenian intelligence, and there are Armenians all around the world that are in this field. And if we could just kind of link them, as DigiTec's doing, to the opportunity in front of us, I think that Armenian intelligence, augmented by artificial intelligence, could be a very big deal for us. So what I'm going to talk to you about today builds on what Rev said, but from a very different angle. So I come from the startup world. For 38 years, I've been involved in starting companies at the interface between biology, technology, and human health and sustainability. That's the space we occupy. And in the last 25 years, I've founded and run a firm called Flagship Pioneering, which has developed a way to conceive and create new high-tech, biotech companies in an industrial scale, meaning thousands of people now work on creating many, many companies. And so what I'm going to show you is how AI has transformed everything that we do over the last 8 years, not over the last 1 or 2 years, because these forces we could see coming, and in particular, what the promise of AI is, and even a bigger thing, in my view, with respect to what Rev said, which is a huge thing, physical AI, and that is basically what AI can do to science. Science, otherwise known as humans acquiring knowledge about nature, is the most fundamental activity humans have done since their existence. That is the consequence of us having a brain. And last year, you may have noticed in passing, I mentioned that the biblical story of Genesis and of biting the apple from the tree of knowledge has condemned humans to seek knowledge for the rest of their existence. This is the first time we've developed a tool of such a significance, in my view, that for the first time we'll be able to understand the nature of the physical world, but also the nature of what it is to be human in ways that we have really only just begun to imagine. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to tell you at the very end of my talk about a concept that I call polyintelligence. And polyintelligence is where human, machine, and nature's intelligence come together. And I think it will really redefine what it is to be alive and to really exist on this planet. But before that, you're going to have to humor me with a few other things. I think it's fair to say that the world of healthcare, of food security, energy, etc., the Industrial Revolution, all of this has been about an engineered world and a discovered world. Humans have made discoveries, humans have built things, and we know we are the beneficiaries of that, including the chips that NVIDIA sells, the GPUs. All of the things we benefit from have either been discovered or made by humans. But we think that we are now beginning to have systems that can truly just generate novelty. Generation, which is not engineering, meaning solving a problem or trying to make something a little bit better, but generation is what nature does. It creates completely unexpected, unforeseen capabilities. So all you have to do is just look at the person next to you, or look at the plants in your home, or look at the food you eat. None of that was human engineered, human developed, or human discovered. All of that was generated some other way. But we've never been able to compete with that. And I think that's what the future really holds. Now, I want to tell all of my colleagues, which is the majority here in this room, that are IT specialists, that information technology in the human endeavor is a relatively new field. 60, 70, 80 years, maybe going back to a famous master's thesis at MIT by Claude Shannon, who really put forward the foundation of information theory. But it's a new thing. The original information technology is biology. It's just that nobody thought of it that way. We've never studied biology as simply an information processing system. But if you look at the code, it's a 4-bit code, not a 2-bit code. if you look at the processing of the code, the storage of the code, and what it is that the cells, the trillion cells in your body are doing, all they're doing is computing. Simple as that. They're sensing, they're actuating, they're doing things that we could never dream of doing with computers today. They're doing it without a fault. And once in a while, they have a fault, and then we call that disease. But the magic of what is happening across 8 billion people on the planet, I don't think we view as information technology, but we are about to. And that's going to be a very interesting change. Now, the last year kind of was an interesting break point in the sense that the rest of the world started realizing that the things that are happening with AI as it relates to science are a big deal. And so you could see how the waves of AI, by the way, people who are my age knew of AI in the 60s and 70s. I learned about it in 1980 when I was an undergraduate, and in fact, I did some work in this field. And it's been around for quite a while in different forms. But the most recent form that you just heard an excellent expose by Rev about, generative AI, is really relatively new. And in fact, the last year's two of the Nobel Prizes, both in physics and in chemistry, were given to essentially breakthroughs in recent AI, recognizing the people that are driving some of this. Now, my firm, I mentioned Flagship Pioneering, embraced this idea. We call this pioneering intelligence. The idea was, what could we do with technological intelligence, not human intelligence only, in the fields of human health? And we created a group called Pioneering Intelligence. And while I'm not going to tell you a lot about that today, it's about 250 people that are working on all sorts of ways to use AI, and you're going to hear about this, to design, to make, to improve, to test, to identify patients, all sorts of things. And I'm going to summarize little vignettes from that to give you a sense of what's becoming possible. But just all of that is centrally done through a dedicated effort. And AI has touched companies in our history for 25 years, from the very first company we started, which ironically was a neural net company trying to understand how humans can design products better, all the way to Moderna, which you know about in the vaccine field. What you don't know is the massive investment we had made in developing the data-driven models needed to be able to design a vaccine literally in an hour after we got the sequence. We go around giving talks saying in a day. We think that's a little not credible. Sometimes we say a week. But in fact, our computing systems generated what ended up going into humans in about an hour. It's not an hour after we got the sequence. It's an hour after 15 years of work we had done to get to that moment when, in fact, we could do this. And so what AI can do in terms of gathering a massive amount of data and creating models that poise you to do some impressive things, we already could see in 2020, 2021. But all of these are simply words and names. Let me put a little bit more stories behind them. I'm going to rush through this. There's a lot of slides in this presentation. If you're interested, you can go learn about these companies. My point is just to create an impression, not to create comprehension as much. So let me just go through this quickly. So one company is Generate Biomedicines. Generate basically uses generative AI, as the name suggests, and has done for a bunch of years, to design completely novel human proteins that can go into your body and do whatever we want, basically. And by whatever we want, we mean that if whatever target you want to hit with, let's say, an antibody, without much experimental work at all, we've trained with so many millions of data points that we can literally sit and say, I want to touch this protein at this spot on the three-dimensional structure, and the computer will spit out 50 different sequences, all of which will hit there, some of which better than others. And so you close the time circle from conception to actually having a proto-drug. It's not a drug until you test it in humans, but getting to a proto-drug is actually very, very rapid. And so we've used this to design some pretty advanced medicines. The most advanced one is going after asthma and COPD in a drug that targets this molecule called TSLP. And that molecule today sells about $5 billion a drug. There's an existing drug. You have to inject it once every 4 weeks. We've computationally generated a version that you inject every 6 months. It's equally as good, and it's about to be tested in the last stage of phase 3 trials. We're hopeful that over the next 2 years, we'll generate data needed to do that. That's 1 out of 12 programs that the computer has actually already advanced into clinical and preclinical testing. Another one is a company called Profound Therapeutics. What does Profound do? Profound asks the question, What if we don't actually know much about the biology in our bodies and we're missing big chunks of information? Well, if you ask that question as a scientist, they'll laugh you out of a scientific meeting. But if you ask that question as an entrepreneur, you can at least try to answer it. And it turns out, with AI, with computation, we were able to identify tens of thousands of proteins that are made in our bodies, in humans, that nobody knew existed. This was 3 years ago. It was not 30 years ago. There's no Nobel Prize associated with this. The reality is that we only could see what we looked at. So just like in a telescope, the better the telescopes got, the more information you got, the more stars you saw. They were there all along. You just didn't see them. Well, the computational platforms are allowing us to see targets for new drugs by the thousands. You might say, what are we going to do with this? It costs $1 billion to develop each drug. And that would be a good question. I don't have a good answer to that question. But eventually, we hope that the regulators will use these techniques and get much, much more comfortable approving newer and newer drugs now that we actually have the tools to do that. So that's what Profound does. I'm going to skip a couple of these in the interest of time just to touch on it as we move. A priori basically took millions, again, of experimental data sets on viral evolution. You'll all know that the coronavirus that caused COVID-19 is mutating at a very rapid pace even now. Those of you who think you have nothing to worry about, when you actually get a serious form of COVID, you'll have a lot to worry about. And it's a Russian roulette. You're close to Russia, it's Russian roulette as to which one of the times you get infected will actually be serious. We're not the ones saying that. There's 10 million cases of what's called long COVID in the US today. 10 million out of probably 100 million infections, but a subset of which actually caused the immune response to overreact, and that overreaction became a longer-term health issue. So why is this? Because the virus keeps changing. Well, it turns out that using, again, AI-based models, and I'm generalizing, but these are all using the most cutting-edge data models you can get, we could now foresee what mutations the virus can make to escape our immune system. So we can reproduce our immune system by taking human samples. We can take the virus and computationally change it, and then we could see which changes would escape, and then make a vaccine against the changes that we haven't yet seen, but we know it's going to come. That type of data model has never been used for vaccine design, and this entity, a priori, is doing that. Let me give you another example, and then I'm going to switch gears. You may know that drugs can be small molecules or proteins, or now RNA, DNA. In the small molecule world, there's a trick that's relatively new we've learned, which is how do we make a chemical attached to one little spot on a protein, but literally chemically linked to it. And when that happens, that protein is extinguished. That can't do what it's doing. These are called covalent medicines. Now, the industry has 5, 6 examples of these over 30 years of trying with chemistry and biology. We have one group called Expedition Medicines, where they literally have taken hundreds of these kinds of chemicals that they computationally designed, thousands of proteins that they've generated data on, and then in a single experiment, they generate millions of data points from which they're deriving many, many, many of these types of drugs. It's really hard to imagine the people who work on this, who used to work 6 years to come up with one chemistry, now have hundreds in a week. They also don't know what to do with it because the techniques don't exist to test these. But so these are things that are such differences. It's like no cell phone, no electricity, as you heard from Rev. That's what we're witnessing. Okay, so now let me change the gears and tell you, I was going to say a little bit more about this one project that you should pay attention to. I was thinking, sitting in the room, that 10 years ago at the Marriott in Harabarag, I gave a talk about Moderna. And we had not spoken about Moderna externally to the outside world, but I spoke about it here in Armenia. And it was funny because nobody in the room knew what I was talking about, meaning what it would become. But they knew that they had heard about it, which was kind of funny, because we were keeping it pretty secret. But I figured this is safe in Armenia, so I just, at a medical conference that they had, the International Armenian Medical Association, I just laid it out. I don't know whether Lila will be that, but I would pay attention to what I'm going to talk about if, in fact, it becomes something. By the way, it may also extinguish and die. I can't tell you which it is, but at least that's what I think. That's why I'm talking about it here. So what Lila is trying to do, really for the first time to our knowledge, it's a 3-year-old project company, is to achieve what we would call scientific superintelligence. Scientific superintelligence means the intelligence of thousands or millions of scientists all at once. If you want to get a sense of what that would feel like what the grand chess masters like Levon Aharonyan feels when he plays a computer. He's basically playing millions of chess games against a person who's experienced thousands and who's been taught by other people who've studied 100,000. But when you get to tens and hundreds of millions of chess games worth of knowledge brought to bear, that's not a human chess player, that's a superhuman chess player. And the same effect we think will happen in science. And I'll tell you how we're going about carefully building this capability. So, we talk a lot about history. The humans invented the wheel. We think the most important wheel the humans have invented is the wheel of scientific discovery. This is how science is done when they're allowed to be done without lots of intervention by governments like the US. Hypothesis generation, experimental design, build the experiment, do the experiment, interpret the data, change the hypothesis, and you go round and round. That is what every scientist is taught to do. Millions of scientists around the world do, and that's where every invention comes from, basically. So the question is, how can we take that wheel of science and convert it into a Waymo? That is an autonomous experience. What can you do using AI to generate hypotheses, a different form of AI to convert it into experimental protocols, to run the protocol, to interpret the data, alter the hypothesis? Can we do these things? And before you sit there and go, this sounds like science fiction, remind yourself that every major breakthrough in the world, including GPUs coming from game-based chips, was science fiction before it became science. In fact, if you take nothing away from this talk, you should realize that if you avoid science fiction, you avoid the future of science. Because all future of science is initially science fiction, until somebody proves that it's not. So anybody who tells you otherwise, anybody who tells you, no, science fiction's this is real science, it's just that the experiments haven't been done to decide which it is. In our case, we think these experiments will be done more and more with AI. So this is not just going to touch, and I'll come back to this in a second, this is not just going to touch health, it's going to touch every aspect of science. Certainly in medicine, in agriculture, in food. The 95 trillion of expense that Rev referred to in the rest of the physical world, look, healthcare is $10 trillion expense a year. Food, energy, you're talking about 40, 50 trillion when you bring it all together. All of those fields are touched by science. They're based on science. Energy, where do you think fusion is going to come from? Where do you think wind power came from? All of these have underlying them scientific and technological advances, and we think this therefore can address all of that. So the question is, how do you get to autonomous scientific platform? And you don't do it overnight, and you don't do it easily, and you definitely have to do it carefully. So let me tell you how we're at least beginning to do this. So we're building a model, a cognitive model, that we think, rather than training specialized models to do each element, over time will become a generalizable model. So that's one thing. There is no scientist, even physicists, even mathematicians who consider themselves polymaths, are not actually able to contribute to biology, chemistry in the same way, because there's a lot of specialization in these fields. We think in the realm of AI, in the realm of AI-based models, this will actually be somewhat different. So we are very much trying to put the foundations for reasoning engines that have access to dedicated knowledge bases, simulators, the computational tools, of which there are literally millions out there today, and an important thing I'll describe to you down here, which is what we call AI science factories. So this is kind of at least the architecture of what we have in mind. We've already begun on the cognitive part. We have developed reasoning models and put them up against the absolute best deep reasoning research models that are out there. By the way, that are trained on all language, text, graphs of every kind, not scientific. We've trained these to actually do the job of science. And in that regard, at least we're not worse. We're not claiming we're better, because this race of comparing how good you are when it comes to reasoning is a little bit of a measurement game, not necessarily, but at least we're not worse. And in fact, in some places, we're better. There are different ways in which we benchmark. We constantly are comparing ourselves. And if you look at the kinds of things you have to do to be able to do scientific research in biology or in material science, the two areas we're active in, there are a bunch of ways you can actually convince yourself that there are ways to do better than generalized LLM models. We're building an interface where scientists will actually inevitably find their partners, their companions to conduct scientific research. things that might in the future look something like this. We have this internally. I'm going to spare you. I think there's some volume on this, but I may not have. Like literally things that where the scientist might type, we want to design a de novo binder to HER2. Tell me what's known about the structure. You don't have to know much about this field. And it's going to come back with a set of relevant facts, a set of papers, and things you might want to do. It will read entire literature that's out there, bring some next steps to the table. It'll start designing a binder to this target. Literally, it'll go to databases that have structure capabilities. It'll start telling you, this is not kind of made up stuff. We have scientists in labs that are doing these on a daily basis. And it's kind of first early contact, but it's an interesting thing to go after. Let me just keep going. I'm not going to have a lot of time to do all this in detail, but let me rush through it. So the way we think about it is that human-based science of the sort we've had for hundreds and hundreds of years and gotten pretty good at will give way to initially autonomous workflows. So these are agents that will allow us to, in a specialized way, at least do the elements of this. And then eventually, we think that this will lead to, again, I referred to earlier, science factories. Now, this might be interesting if we can have the volume.
An aliquot 23 microliters of master mix A into each well of a 96-well PCR plate, using a P20 12-channel X buffer, and 52.5 microliters of polymerase, for a total volume of 2,006.
You might wonder what this is. This is what people do in biology labs. This is what we've all been trained to do. This is what we're trying to replace. This clip is 4 minutes of procedure that it takes to do the experiment that's in one graph in one paper. Now you can go on YouTube, you can go on TikTok probably and figure out how to do it. But it's nuts that in this environment, we still do things in the way that you're seeing. And what might be possible?
Aliquot 23 microliters of master mix.
For most people in the room, it's probably reminding you why you didn't do biology, right? So this is, at least that's the effect it has for me. So the question is, what can happen instead if we think forward? And I'm going to show you a little bit more on this, but I'm not going to have time to show the whole video. Basically, this is the systems that these are the systems we're building today. So essentially, you could have, it's obviously going to be modular design. Whatever piece exists already, we can combine into a factory setting. The elements of automation, fortunately, exist already, but there are some interesting new innovations that Lila is making, particularly to make interoperability between all sorts of biological measurements and steps. So these are the kind of systems that exist already today, but the interesting thing is how do you actually bring these together? There's some new cool technologies that are the equivalent of robotics for the laboratory setting that essentially allow a workflow that can take things and do things in literally, you could set up an experiment having done nothing in the area and essentially start generating data within hours or a day or two. It used to take 6 months to set up a capability from scratch, and these are the labs actually that we have operating in Cambridge, Massachusetts. To our knowledge, this is the most advanced beginnings of AI science factories that are out there. What's important is that already this raises the question of how can this be controlled, how can you do this responsibly, and we can touch on that as well in the end. So this is kind of what we intend to build. So maybe someday in Armenia, not only will there be data centers, but there will be science factories. And these science factories require relatively little scientific expertise. That doesn't mean we don't need scientific experts. I didn't say that. What I said is that if you have 10 scientific experts, you might be able to compete with somebody that has 1,000. That is hard to fathom, but in reality, that would be the ability for small countries, in my view, to compete with larger countries that already have spent hundreds of billions attaining their advantage, only to realize that the next generation doesn't need that level of human intervention. So that's kind of an interesting thing. These are the areas that we're active in this one little company. I should mention, Lila is about 2.5, 3 years old. There was an article that for the first time described its existence in New York Times in May of this year, if you're interested in learning about it. We haven't said much about it. We have said recently that we have raised in a first round, Series A round, of about $530 million to develop this capability. And a lot of tech players, including a lot of the big companies, have joined to see if this is a reality, this could be a reality. So we're doing materials, as I said, we're doing proteins. So let me give you examples of what is already becoming possible. You've heard of mRNA, we've heard of mRNA. And so here's what they're trying to do is show what's possible with much, much smaller footprints, teams, and operations. 3 scientists, none of them were mRNA scientists, using this Lila platform for about 4 months, essentially took on the best designs of mRNA that are published and see if they could do better. The only thing happening is the AI is generating the hypothesis, doing the experiment, interpreting the data, generating the hypothesis. And what you're seeing here is actually the best forms of mRNA, for example, the U1s that were used in the COVID vaccine, and what they were able to do, again, not as experts in this field. This is a log order improvement. This is a substantial improvement of what it's doing. The other thing you care about mRNA is how long does it last? How quickly does the effect go away? You're seeing in these yellow, orange colors, much, much higher effects. Again, same 3 people over 4 months. Frankly, they didn't know what they were doing, meaning they did not read the literature. They did not become experts. They literally just let the program figure out and just do the experiments. That's what we're seeing there. What if we could generate new binders? Again, a team of 4 scientists. There's nothing magic about 4, just so that they're building teams of 4. 6 months, basically computationally generated hundreds of binders. These are 3-dimensional structures that the computer says, make these. I mentioned to you one of our other companies, so these guys are doing this even at larger scales. And then we compared it to everything that's been published. And these are absolutely over and over again, far better than what anything has been done using conventional biology. You don't have to believe any one of these, but in aggregate, it's a little hard to say. We can't be competitive. Another completely unrelated example. What if you may know that there's a big competition going on for rare earth metals? In fact, China and the US are threatening each other to cut off supplies, etc. But it's pretty clear that if you don't use rare earth metals, hopefully, I'm being shooed off stage, so I'll probably be a little late, but that's okay. So can you do this without rare earth metals? Now 2 scientists in a 4-month program, the following. Basically, we've gone after things that you need rare earth metal for to do the actual catalysis and replace them with things that are absolutely abundantly available. And this is what you're kind of looking at. This is a platinum group metal. That is the best way to do this experiment. Already from some of these, this is the best. We're basically beginning to see non-platinum group metals, much more abundant, being able to start moving up this curve. That has a big market opportunity. Hydrogen production, green hydrogen production, substantial amount of work improving output there. Again, entering the space without much expertise in the area. And then if you look at these, the Nobel Prize this week was given for metal organic frameworks. Some of you in this field will know. Our team went in and started designing new metal organic frameworks. I mean, it's nuts. These are not world-class experts in this area. They just kind of said, okay, let's just unleash this capability, and they're seeing step-by-step improvements. Again, those of you interested can interact with the company, find out. Let me skip ahead. And then you have to ask yourself, is this the end of it, or is this the beginning of it? And since you haven't heard about this before, I assume it's the beginning of it. In other words, we're not claiming we're the best at this. We are claiming we were one of the first. But where this will go, it's kind of hard to know. Where at DigiTec, 2026 will be. Forget about 2030. I can't really tell you. But that's where we're going. Now, I'm going to say a couple of preposterous things before they really get me off the stage, so I'll be about another few minutes. So let me just go there. So far, everything I've told you is actually pretty mundane, but let me tell you a little bit more. Look, we think that the capability, if it's achievable, to allow humans to coexist with scientific superintelligence and be the beneficiaries of scientific superintelligence for counteracting global warming, for counteracting disease instead of accepting it, for thinking about how to age in a healthy way as opposed to assume that once you get sick, you're going to die. All of those things are possible. And here's the interesting thing. We talk a lot about human IQ. And it's a controversial thing, but you people have measurement techniques. This is not my slide, and I reluctantly use it because I told my colleagues not to use it, but I figured I'm in Armenia, I can use it. So you guys don't tell anybody. Armenian IQ is probably higher, but whatever. We keep telling ourselves that. But chimp IQ, it's not clear, is apparently estimated to be around 25 in a scale of human, in terms of some of the cognitive abilities that people can see. I'm sure it's an underestimate. Humans about 100. And humans, basically in science, have created about 8 trillion of value. The question will be, oops, I'm going backwards. What will scientific superintelligence do? And what kind of market does that open up? And we think that just in the areas we're working, which are laid out here, so this is all ongoing programs in the capital I mentioned to you. They're going into dedicated teams to do this. But these are fairly gigantic immediate markets. These are not potential down the line markets. There's some pretty important things to disrupt. And whether it's solar cells or catalysts or coatings or electronics, it's going to be soon hard to compete without availing yourself to this type of amplification of human capability. And so, could it, this is now very grandiose, so forgive me for that, could it lead to kind of minimal, if not zero disease? Could it lead to abundant fresh water? Could it lead to abundant energy? We think that there are specific ways to get there, and no human will be able to envision all this. But again, armed with the kind of technology humans have built, we think that it is very, very exciting, and with all the caution that comes with it, all the inequities that will come with it, because some people will have this, some people will not. The rate of advance will go even higher for those who have it. They will use it potentially in the wrong way to oppress people. These are all things that much higher paid politicians are going to have to deal with than I do. But we also as scientists need to constrain what we're able to do, or at least talk about these things very openly. And we are doing it. We have a whole dedicated team of people at Lila and at Flagship thinking about the ethical considerations and the self-governance we need to do. Otherwise, other people will govern it for us. So we think this is one of the most important things. I'm going to skip ahead here. I had another example which you will not see today. But those of you interested, you can look it up. It's called Xtuitive. It's an agent-based system we've built, but I'm going to skip it. So let me end on this, as I promised. So where does all this leave us? Well, I've been talking to you about AI with agents. I didn't show you examples. We have a bunch in here on the science side. AI factories, AI superintelligence, these are going to happen, we think. But I'm going to end on something that has become super interesting, at least to me. And so I wrote a letter about this beginning of the year. Anybody who's interested can go look it up. It's not very long reading. And it's not very profound, but it's interesting. And it's what I call polyintelligence. So let me lay out the case for why we should start thinking about polyintelligence, not just AI as a form of machine intelligence. So poly, as a word, means both convergence of a bunch of different things, but also implies an abundance of things, like having many, many different versions. And why don't we use this word? This is the thing that I'm referring to. So it's about polyintelligence. The idea for this, for me, and the inspiration was a long-term interest I've had in a pretty unique person in Leonardo da Vinci, not as to what he did in arts, not as to what he did with invention, but his absolute obsession with nature. And the fact that he actually spent a lot of his time figuring out how birds are doing what they do, how nature, how structures work. And this obsession of nature, which has subsided since his time in the minds of the most kind of, I'd say, brilliant designers, makers. Of course, there's always lessons we get from nature, but not at the level of what he did. This, I think, is important to get inspiration from for the following reason. So the interface between human intelligence and biology and nature is called biology. Of course, you could say also chemistry, because a lot of nature is chemistry. Physics also concerns itself with nature, but it's kind of more of a galactic kind of forces and very tiny forces. All of science is in a way the interface between human intelligence and what's going on physically around us. And we are, of course, here talking about the interface between human intelligence and computing. Computing is very hard for our minds to understand, and AI-based computing is extremely hard for us to understand because a billion parameter model doesn't lend itself to our measly brains to try to explain. And so, as you may know, in AI, there's fields of people who make explainer models that try to help humans understand what these complex models do. It's not clear to me which one has it right, but in any case, it's a tough interface. So we have that interface. But I would expose to you to the possibility that what we have wrong is that we're thinking about nature as some kind of a existing thing, as opposed to many, many, many forms of intelligence. And I think that we've had it wrong in science to view nature in a way, in a static, designed way, even though we didn't design it, and that we need to somehow reverse engineer it and figure it out. Let me explain what I mean. A virus, tiny little virus, almost took down the whole human health system, and 100 years ago killed tens of millions, and over time has killed hundreds of millions of people. Viruses, just viruses. How is it doing that? Well, because it's figured out how to mutate, how to avoid this, how to avoid that. How is that not intelligence? And then you could look at your immune system that goes after cancers. Most of you may not know that every day you're alive, since you were born, you have micro-cancers in your body. And your immune system competently destroys them until it doesn't. and that's why you get cancer. It's not like you get cancer and then your immune system goes after it. Your immune system is protecting you from it all the time. How's that not intelligence, right? If such a thing was a computer virus that they put on your computer, everybody's going, wow, look at the intelligence of this computer virus attacking my system, cybersecurity. The point is I'm trying to make is that nature is a whole bunch of forms of intelligence. Now you might say, how could that be? We know intelligence, it requires neurons. But actually AI doesn't require neurons, it requires a silicon form of computation that is emulating it. And I would argue that we should start thinking about nature's intelligence as nothing more than reinforcement learning about nature embodied in all the DNAs that have survived over the entire time we've been around. So think of DNA as the large language model of nature. Everything in it is being encoded, not statically, but dynamically. It's a processing, reactive form, adaptive form. It hasn't invented language, except a form of it has. It's the form of nature's intelligence that led to human brains, that invented. Everything is this continuum of forms of intelligence. And the reason I say that is the last thing I'll end with, which is, if you realize nature's intelligence involves millions of molecules interacting in thousands of ways, for which billion parameter models are inadequate, maybe trillion Google parameters will be needed. Like, these are big numbers. But the machines are building the capability to have that kind of complexity. Nature has that kind of complexity. And if we put them next to each other, they will begin to emulate each other. It's a question of data generation. The 8 examples I gave in the beginning were little examples of that. The problem is that the humans will not understand any of that. We'll neither understand nature's intelligence, nor are we going to understand the computing intelligence. In my view, I may be wrong. You can tell me 10 years from now, this was no Moderna, whatever, it doesn't matter. The thing is that we as humans, for the first time, are going to have to realize that there are some things we will understand because they lend themselves to mathematical reductionism, and there are lots of things we don't understand. And if we want to affect the things we don't understand, the combination of machine intelligence, nature intelligence, and human, this polyintelligence, is what it'll take to do that. So I'll leave you with that absurd or surreal thought, and thank you for listening. Thank you.